Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. King Charles's diagnosis of cancer has led people to ask, well, what would happen if the king became seriously incapacitated? We know at the moment that Buckingham Palace has said that he intends to continue with his duties, particularly his paperwork duties, but that he's just going to stop his public-facing duties at the moment. And that makes sense because if you're being treated for cancer, you may be immunosuppressed and therefore it's inappropriate for you to be going out meeting with lots of people. But what would happen in circumstances if he did later become seriously incapacitated? Well, there are effectively three options. The first is the appointment of Councillors of State, second is Regency, and the third is Abdication. Let's start first with Councillors of State. The king can delegate some or most of his powers to Councillors of State. So, for example, he could just delegate specific powers, like the power to open Parliament, for example, or he could delegate all his powers, well, most of his powers anyway, and this most commonly happens when the king is travelling overseas. So Councillors of State are appointed, and two of them are appointed, and they act jointly in exercising those powers. So they do things like give royal assent to bills, they receive the credentials of ambassadors, and they hold Privy Council meetings, those types of things. So who are these Councillors of State? Who can be chosen? Well, that's dictated by the Regency Act of 1937, and it says that the Councillors of State are the spouse of the monarch and the first four people who are adults who are in line to the throne and are not otherwise disqualified. So that leaves as Councillors of State the Queen Camilla, Prince William, Prince Harry, Prince Andrew, and Princess Beatrice. Now there are some complications here, and that is Prince Harry would be unable to exercise the power to the extent that he is outside of the United Kingdom because he lives in America. Prince Andrew and Princess Beatrice, as well as Prince Harry for that matter, because they are not working royals, are generally not appointed to be Councillors of State. Now, when Charles became king, that led to a bit of a problem because if Camilla was travelling with him while he was overseas, she wouldn't be able to be a Council of State either, and that would leave just Prince William, and of course the power is supposed to be exercised jointly, so that's not going to work. So after Charles became king, he asked Parliament to enact a new law about Councillors of State, which provided for Princess Anne and Prince Edward both to also be Councillors of State. So the pool of potential Councillors of State was expanded in 2022. So what can a Councillor of State do? Well, as I said, they can carry out just those specific functions delegated to them, or most of the king's functions, but they can't do certain things. So first of all, they can't dissolve Parliament unless they're given express instructions to do so by the king personally, and they can't create peers, and that's in the legislation. But it's also generally assumed that they can't exercise prerogative powers of the monarch where there's potential discretion involved. And so therefore they couldn't appoint a prime minister, for example. Equally, they cannot exercise the powers of the king in relation to each of the king's realms. So they are the other countries like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Tuvalu, Papua New Guinea, etc., that the king is head of state. So those matters fall outside the powers of Councillors of State. Now, if the king became far more incapacitated, instead you could have a regency. So according to the Regency Act, this occurs if the king is, by reason of infirmity of mind or body, incapable for the time being of performing his royal functions. Now, in that case, the king does not control whether or not a regency occurs or for how long. The king does control that in relation to Councillors of State, but not in relation to a regency. And a regency is instead determined by a declaration made by three or more of the following people. So you have the king's spouse, so Queen Camilla. you have the Lord Chancellor and the Speaker of the House of Commons. So those two represent Parliament. And then you have the Lord Chief Justice of England and the Master of the Rolls. And so they represent the law. So you have the law side, the political side, and the personal side all represented. And amongst those 5 people, 3 of them have to be satisfied and declare, and if it's a medical issue, taking into account medical evidence, etc., that the king is incapable of exercising his royal functions in order for there to be a regency. Now, who gets to be regent? Well, the UK's Regency Act also specifies that. It requires that the person who is first in line to the throne, who's an adult and not otherwise disqualified because, they became a Catholic or whatever, they're the person who becomes the regent. So in this case, it would be Prince William. Now, if William died or himself became incapacitated, then we'd be in a bit of a pickle, because the next in line, who's an adult, would be Prince Harry, because of course Prince William's children are still too young. Now the problem here again is the question of Harry's, in this case, domicile. So according to the Act, if he's domiciled outside the United Kingdom, he cannot be the regent. There's a bit of an argument about Prince Harry's domicile. So we know he lives in the United States of America, and that's his permanent home. But previously he did have a lease on a cottage in the Windsor estate in the United Kingdom, and for that reason it was said that his domicile was still in the United Kingdom. However, he no longer has that lease on that property. As far as I know, he doesn't have any home in the United Kingdom. So if we did end up in that situation, and of course it's a lot of ifs, there would probably be some kind of legal argument about where Harry was domiciled, or he would come quickly back to the United Kingdom and get himself a home if he wanted to exercise the power of regent. And if he didn't, then the next in line is Prince Andrew, and that would certainly raise a bit of a kerfuffle if he became regent. Anyway, going back to the scenario of a regency for King Charles, Prince William becomes the regent. What powers does he have? Well, he has pretty much all the powers that the king can exercise in the United Kingdom, but interestingly cannot give royal assent to any bill that would change the rules of succession to the crown, for obvious reasons. So this means, however, that if there were a regency, and then King Charles decided, look, it would just be better for me to abdicate and pass the throne on to William rather than having him act as regent, and if legislation was required to do that, and there's an argument about that, but if that was the case, then the regent, William, would not be able to assent to that legislation, and so that would leave things in a bit of a difficulty. What you might have to do then would be to undo the regency, so you can end a regency if 3 of the relevant 5 people again say that the king is no longer incapacitated and unable to exercise his functions, and then get the king himself to do the abdication by abdicating and assenting to the relevant legislation. So a bit tricky. But again, one of those out there scenarios that's very unlikely to happen. Now, the Regency Act does not give the regent power to make and exercise any powers in relation to the realms of which the king is head of state, such as Australia, New Zealand, various realms in the Pacific and the Caribbean, etc. So they were all left to their own devices back when the Regency legislation was enacted to decide for themselves what to do about a regent. Canada dealt with it in a rather odd fashion by, in 1947, getting all the King's powers delegated to the Governor-General. Well, that's all fine, except when you want to appoint or remove a Governor-General, which can lead to some difficulties. New Zealand, in its Constitution Act, inserted a provision to specifically deal with this and says that whoever is the regent in the United Kingdom for the Crown, they get to exercise the powers in relation to New Zealand during that regency. So what did Australia do? Absolutely nothing. We've been doing nothing for a very long time. Every time this issue is raised, it gets put in the too hard basket. Okay. Getting back to the third option of abdication, this actually also leads to quite difficult questions in relation to how it would operate for each of the various realms of which the king is head of state. Now, when King Edward VIII abdicated in 1936, it was achieved by both an instrument of abdication, which he signed personally, as well as legislation that was enacted by the UK Parliament with the consent or assent. There's a whole lot of complications as to who did what and how, but the various dominions, all agreed to it. Some said they had to do their own legislation, etc., but one way or another, all of the various dominions at the time agreed. Now, this isn't possible today, at least in relation to Australia, because since the Australia Acts of 1986, the United Kingdom can no longer legislate for Australia in a way that has effect as part of Australian law. So the method that was used to deal with the abdication in 1936 in relation to the various realms is not going to work today. So abdication therefore raises quite difficult questions about whether, for example, you would need to have a separate abdication in relation to each of the crowns. So the king would abdicate as King of Australia separately. Or in Australia, the other possibility is that we could try and rely on what's known as covering clause 2 of our constitution, which is really a definitional clause, which says that all the references to the king, or actually the queen in the constitution, mean Queen Victoria and her heirs and successors in the sovereignty of the United Kingdom. So that would be another way of approaching it, although I have my doubts whether a court would use that provision in that particular way. Now, in terms of the conceptual problem of having all these separate kings being the same person, I once read a memorandum by a senior British public servant from many decades ago who was having trouble with the conceptual idea of divisibility of the crown, and that is that you can have a separate king of Australia and a king of Tuvalu and a king of Papua New Guinea, etc., etc. And the way he put it, which was rather ghoulish but quite striking, was that, well, if we in Britain decided to execute our king again, like we did into King Charles I, he said, how many times would we have to chop off his head? You know, do we chop off his head once for the King of the United Kingdom, and once again for the King of Australia, and again for the King of Canada? And what if one of those realms, like Australia, didn't want the king's head chopped off? How do you deal with that then? That question illustrated that there can be genuine problems with having different officers with potentially conflicts of interests and representing different constituencies who have different wishes, where the offices are all held by the same person. Because of the potential constitutional messiness of dealing with the king's separate realms, that's 14 along with the United Kingdom, making it 15 all up at the moment, it's probably likely that no one would want to go anywhere near an abdication. It's just frankly too tricky. Okay, so what are the consequences for Australia? If the king were incapacitated and councillors of state or a regent were appointed, would it cause any real problem in Australia? Well, the king's only substantial remaining constitutional functions in Australia are appointing the Governor-General and the state governors and removing them where advised to do so. The king also does other stuff. He has a role in relation to some honours and, symbolic and ceremonial stuff, but that can probably be dealt with otherwise. It's the constitutional issues that are the serious ones. In Australia, the Governor-General's term for the current one, David Hurley, is expected to end around the middle of the year. So what would happen if the king at that time was seriously incapacitated and a regent or councillors of state had been appointed? Well, the problem is they couldn't appoint a new Governor-General for Australia. So what will we do then? Well, there's a couple of options. The first is David Hurley could just continue being Governor-General. There's no actual formal term limits. You just serve at the pleasure of the monarch, and so you can just keep going until such time as you get replaced by someone else. So he could keep going, fulfilling the role. The second option is that he may not wish to keep going. He may have other commitments, and so he might well resign his office, and then in the circumstances, if there was a vacancy or he was unable or unwilling to continue to fulfil the function of Governor-General, then in Australia the practice is for the most senior state governor to then fulfil the role. And there are what's called dormant commissions that exist long term to allow people to do that. So that's what ordinarily happens if the Governor-General's, overseas or ill or etc. So it's not a big deal. So the relevant state governor would go and fill in. What about the state level? Well, if the state governor, there's a vacancy or they're unwell or they're off in Canberra being Governor-General, or administrator is the technical term, then the governor's position is normally filled by a lieutenant governor, or in some cases an administrator. And the practice there, at least in some states, not all states, is to use the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and then go down as a matter of continuity, go down the list of seniority of judges. So if anything catastrophic happened, there's always someone in a list who can then eventually step up and fill the responsibility. But you can see now what the problem's going to be. If you had a regency for a long period of time, and you weren't able to appoint new governors, or your governor was off being Governor-General, and it meant that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court had to fill the governor's functions for a long period of time, it would be problematic because the Chief Justice has a really serious job they have to do. They're administering the court, they're sitting on judgments and cases, etc. So it's not sustainable in the long term to manage it that way. And so that's one of the reasons why you'd probably want to fix the problem. The other reason is that if there is a regency or councils of state are appointed, there's no one who has power to dismiss the Governor-General if the Governor-General was engaging in misbehaviour or something of the kind. So that means that if you're in the middle of a constitutional crisis like the one in 1975, the Governor-General could act knowing that no one could dismiss them, so that the Prime Minister couldn't advise a monarch to get rid of the Governor-General. And that's problematic because it does rather unbalance the constitutional pressures that have been deliberately built into the system by giving the Governor-General a substantially stronger hand and weakening the position of the Prime Minister. So again, not a really good idea to leave things in that state for a long time. Now, can we do anything about it? Well, some people have argued the only way you could fix it would be by having a referendum. I don't agree, and I think at this stage in the game we're all rather not enthusiastic about holding another referendum at the moment. So, not a good idea. Can we do it without a referendum? Well, I think we can. So I think we can do it by using exactly the same system that we used back in 2015 to change the rules of succession to the Crown of Australia by removing, at the time, the sexism, so the favouring of males over females, and some of the rules about, marrying Catholics and all that sort of stuff. So that was done in 2015 by a method that is in the Constitution. It's in section 5138 of the Constitution, and it allows each of the states to legislate, to request the Commonwealth to legislate to do the thing that none of them individually could do, but that the UK Parliament could have done at the time of Federation. Now, given that the UK Parliament at the time of Federation could have enacted a law concerning Regency, then under section 5138, the Commonwealth and the states collectively using that method could do the same thing and make a law with respect to Regency. So the problem can be solved, but administratively it's a bit tedious to go through the process and do it. While it's not essential to fix the problem, I think it would be wise, as a matter of good constitutional housekeeping, to try and resolve it while there's not a crisis and before any real difficulties arise. For those who are more interested in the nitty-gritty constitutional details, all that stuff about using section 5138 and whether you need a referendum and what power the Commonwealth has, etc., has a lot of complicated constitutional law reasoning behind it. So if anyone wants to know, I'll put a link in the commentary area to an article I wrote, which was published in the Public Law Review many years back, about Regency and the realms, and it sets out all the reasoning there as to how you get to what the problem is and how you get to fix it. So thank you for watching the Constitutional Clarion. I hope you found it illuminating, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.